fellow a ISPI, non mi ricordo mai.
Oh, we're actually even early.
Titled Blurring the Lines, Exploring North Africa-Sahel Nexus. My name is Luca Raineri. I'm assistant professor at the Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies in Pisa, as well as associate research fellow at ISPI. And I'm very glad to be surrounded here by excellent colleagues, Isabel Werenfels, senior fellow at the German Institute of International and Security Affairs, or SWP, Jalel Harshawi, Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, and Miret Mabrouk, Director of the Egypt and Horn of Africa Program at the Middle East Institute. We are dealing today with Africa, and particularly with the connection between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. In that sense, we would like to approach the topic of the Sahel, which is part of the title, and understand the notion of Sahel in its etymological sense. That is to say, the shore of the Sahara Desert connecting North Africa countries to Sub-Saharan Africa, meaning that this goes well beyond the concept of Central Sahel or G5 Sahel to actually include a strip of countries from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea. And this matters because North Africa is actually what connects the Mediterranean. Asking in this panel whether the Sahara Desert represents a buffer or a connector between these two regions. And this is because growing tensions north and south of the Sahara, coupled with porous borders, contribute to political unrest, trafficking in arms, fuel, as well as migrants, resulting in an unstable security landscape. Moreover, in the context of increased multipolarity and a changing world order, a more assertive role of non-Western international players, coupled with growing regional rivalries, have a profound impact on local dynamics. Such instability is taking its toll on economic development, civilians, as well as integration between North and Sub-Saharan Africa. How are, therefore, security threats in these two regions interconnected? What strategies are needed to enhance cross-border cooperation? And how can economic integration be scaled up? Or how should European and African governments engage in a more effective dialogue? So to deal with these questions, I'm very glad now to open the discussion, addressing the first question to Isabel, which will deal with the narratives. This is because the concept of the nexus is articulated in narratives as well as imaginaries. So what are the emerging trends in the narratives and imaginaries of the Maghreb countries vis-à-vis Sahel and beyond?
Thank you very much, Luca. It's remarkable how present the Sahel has become in Maghrebi discourses. This was not the case 5 or 10 years ago. And for very different reasons and in very different ways. For one, of course, against the backdrop of the Algerian-Moroccan rivalry, to use a euphemism, maybe hostility would be the better term these days. So we have both countries, Algeria and Morocco, accusing each other of destabilizing its southern borders, the Sahel. Morocco speaks, for instance, of an Iran, Hezbollah, Algeria, Polisario axis, which allegedly provides support for the Polisario, military support. Algiers is speaking of an Moroccan Emirati-Israeli axis, working against Algerian interests in the Sahel, supporting certain illicit activities, lobbying against Algeria, etc. So this is the discursive setting. And generally, of course, there is a lot of talk about Sahel countries' positions on Western Sahara. Every little shift is being monitored, such as more recently a slight tilt of Mali towards the Moroccan position or a consulate of Chad opening in Dakhla. And a second issue very present in the public discourses is, of course, migration from the Sahel and Sub-Saharan Africa. In Tunisia, it's very much steered also, or has been steered from above, in a very anti and even racist discourse, While in Algeria, I think there was quite a shock earlier this year in April when Niger called in the Algerian ambassador to complain about the treatment of its migrants, and that was also a big thing in the Algerian public discourse. And also these days, of course, there's a lot of discussion, particularly in Algeria, how to deal with one's borders. I mean, if you have 2,000 kilometers of borders, over 2,000 with Mali and Niger, of course, it is an issue. And you have long-standing traditional family social ties cross-border. You have illicit cross-border activities, which are the livelihoods of the people on both sides. And whenever there's an effort at closing something, of course, there are enormous protests. We have seen this in the Algerian border in the past. And by the way, and I think this is an interesting aspect of the migration issue, I think the Sahelian countries negotiating or bargaining power has been growing vis-à-vis the Maghreb. In a way, the Maghrebi bargaining power vis-à-vis Europe has been growing because of the migration issue. Very quickly, the last point, the Sahel, but more so even sub-Saharan Africa, is being talked about as opportunity, very much. And this is more recent with regard to the Sahel. I mean, of course, Morocco has for a while been presenting itself as a gate to Africa, but now there is also the Moroccan Atlantic Initiative. I imagine we will speak more about it when we get deeper into it. And there's a lot of talk about trilateral cooperation. What I hear in the Maghreb countries, what we also hear from Mauritania, is a discourse: you Europeans are not welcome anymore in the Sahel. We have long-standing political, social, cultural ties and easier access. We can help you, for instance, implement the Italian Mattei plan, etc. Generally, last remark, getting impatient, if Sub-Sahara is being framed as opportunity, the Sahel more as a challenge, and I haven't even mentioned illicit trade and the armed militant groups. So there is a distinction between Sahel and Sub-Saharan Africa, even with the now more talk of opportunities regarding the Sahel.
Thank you very much. Let me now turn therefore to Jalel. I would like to ask you, throughout history, many different imaginaries have articulated and configured the identity of Libya vis-à-vis its Sahelian neighbors. How are these discourses being framed in the current context?
Thank you, Luca. Thank you, SP, for the invitation. Yeah, in terms of narratives, in terms of, I would say, myths, you have one particular story that has been repeated relentlessly for the last 13 years, is that you have this idea of that destabilization always comes from Libya and seeps southward into the Sahel. And if you look at, let's say, heads of states in sub-Saharan Africa, they keep repeating that at every opportunity. So according to that myth, that phase that did exist between 2011 2013, according to a lot of those voices, keeps repeating like a broken record, which is very disconnected from reality. I would say that southern Libya is, in terms of the security landscape, is not robust, it's not solid. In fact, it's fragile. We saw just a week or so ago skirmishes within the city of Sabha, the capital of the Fezzan, the southwestern province of Libya. They were fighting for hashish routes, all within the control of Haftar's coalition. But the security landscape is relatively stable. What we have seen in the southern part of Libya is effectively sporadic episodes, every 2-3 months. And the latest ISIS incidents, for example, took place according to my recollection, almost 3 years ago. I think it was in January 2022, and I haven't seen much ever since on Libyan soil. But when you look at Niger, there are rebel groups that are not busy actively trying to topple the current junta in Niamey, but you've had growing strength on the part of both Daesh and Janim or Al-Qaeda. And you have to kind of, first of all, notice this trend of growing strength, but at the same time remember the economic crisis, the socio-economic crisis in Libya, and it's always exacerbated in peripheral areas like the south. So when you remember that the communities are connected, you could very well imagine a process in 2025 where you would have these extremist groups finding acceptance in southern Libya in the same way that they have been finding very much in a Mali and kind of scenario acceptance in Niger as we speak. The other myth that I wanted to mention is this idea that Field Marshal Khalifa Haftar and his coalition is both strong in southern Libya in terms of comprehensive territorial control, and committed to fighting terrorism. So I'm not saying he doesn't fight terrorism, but this idea that he is actually investing, or he has been investing, particularly since 2021, resources and equipment and men in southern Libya in order to fight extremists is absolutely false. The reason the coalition invested in the south is because of the profits from illicit activities. And what we have seen is them basically finding arrangements using basically a protection economy kind of logic with ethnic groups in the south. So if you look at the Rat area, it's more like Tuareg or Bari, the same thing. And then you have reliance on Tobu groups in order to find arrangements that are dictated first and foremost by commercial illicit activity type considerations, which means that if you look at the incident, we had violence in Kalinga, the one area in eastern Fezzan in August. It was actually clashes between two parts of the coalition of Haftar, because one son is committed to finding arrangements with the Tobu, Khalid Haftar, and Saddam Haftar has been more working with like Brigade 128, not in a very ideal way, with closer with Tariq and Awlad Suleiman. So you end up with local instability due to issues that you can understand only when you look at illicit activities and considerations about profit sharing and so on and so forth. So the picture, when you look at it carefully and locally in the south, is not driven by security or considerations or commitment to fighting extremism. So you could imagine some ugly scenarios in 2025.
Thank you, Jalil. Miret, the nexus narrative is probably recalibrating the agency between the North and the South. So in this context, how countries in the Horn of Africa see their own agency regarding the alleged nexus connecting the region to North Africa, the Mediterranean, and the broader MENA region?
So thank you. Thank you to ISPI for having us and for doing this. So I think the key word here is agency. Generally speaking, narratives, which are usually Western narratives, tend to refer to these countries in terms that are only ever talk about poverty and conflict and disenfranchisement. They are, I mean, those terms are often patronizing, but also from a foreign policy point of view, not particularly constructive. That doesn't mean that there isn't poverty and disenfranchisement and conflict in the area. Sudan, I mean, we've discussed the horrific numbers coming out of Gaza, but in the 19 months of the Sudanese conflict, probably over 150,000 people have been killed. Over 11 million people have been displaced. It's huge. Ethiopia, just the last civil war in the Tigray region saw over 600,000 people killed. That's over 10% of the Tigray population. So the numbers are huge. But that doesn't take away from the fact that many of these countries do have agency. I'm just going to use one small example because we don't have that much time. And I'll use Somalia. Somalia has a long history of unflattering stereotypes and has just come out from under a dictator. It's a big mess, but a few interesting things have been happening. There's a new president, there is a new direction, and last September, 2 Egyptian C-130 military planes landed with ammunition and arms. That was the first such Egyptian military aid in about 4 decades. And that was based on an agreement, a military agreement that had been struck between Egypt and Somalia back in August. And that agreement was on the basis of a small memorandum of understanding that had been signed in January between Ethiopia and the breakaway Republic of Somaliland. Now, Ethiopia is landlocked, but insists that it has to have a port anyway. So Somaliland said, great, we will lease you some land in return for you recognizing us, because nobody recognizes Somaliland. Not surprisingly, Somalia was livid. Now, it could have gone to the United Nations wringing its hands, and I think it was probably felt, probably quite rightly, that that wouldn't solve anything. So what it did do was sit down and have a chat with Egypt, which has a long-running, simmering, if just barely controlled, dispute with Ethiopia over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Now, Egypt maintains a super conservative foreign policy and has said that it absolutely does not want to go to war over this dam, because this is the continent's largest hydroelectric dam, and Egypt worries that it may disrupt the flow of water from the Nile, and Egypt gets 95% of its water from there. But even if Egypt had wanted to go to war, Egypt is here, Ethiopia is here, and you have, among other things, Sudan and Somalia in the middle. So what Somalia did was sort matters out to make certain that Ethiopia would be tampered in its dealings with Somaliland. So, and it did that without going to the UN or going to anyone else. So again, I'll wrap up, but I think it's a mistake, and generally a Western mistake, to assume that smaller countries that are dealing with conflict have no agency of their own.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you also for reminding the major humanitarian toll regarding the wars in Ethiopia as well as in Sudan. But then the next is not only obviously about narratives, about imaginaries, it's also very much about policies, infrastructures, and so on. So let me ask you, Isabel, what are the main projects and policies that Maghreb countries are deploying to foster connectivity towards the Sahel? And how is, in this context, the lack of political and economic cooperation in the region impacting in this regard?
Okay, I'll try to be short because there's such a plethora of projects, pipelines, air hubs, ports, highways, trains, everything. Let me just pick a few and say one thing, which I think is important, is often on the radar. There's also the question of societal connectivity, social ties. And here, Morocco for years has been working on that in its soft power approach, with training of imams, with using its Sufi orders, etc. But this is just one thing. If we go to the infrastructure project, of course, we have the two competing pipelines that are being talked about from Nigeria via Morocco to Europe, from Nigeria via Algeria to Europe, both of them with a lot of question marks. I think the Algerian one a little less because it's technically less complicated, but in terms of feasibility financing. But then we have the land connectivity issues, and I think there we have the highways. Algeria finished its part of the Trans-Saharan Highway, and interestingly, Mauritania, because of the instability in the rest of the Sahel, is becoming now a main almost hub, landway hub toward Western Africa, but also beyond that. I mean, Morocco only has one landway, which is via Guerguerat, Western Sahara, to Mauritania. Algeria, a few years ago, opened the border crossing. There's more and more trade going that way. And we have a train project to Tindouf, an Algerian train project. And the other side in Mauritania, there are some trains. So there is a few hundred kilometers there to still be done. This is way in the future, but eventually we could get there. But I think the biggest thing at the moment that is being talked about is Morocco's Atlantic Initiative, which seeks to grant access to the Atlantic via the port of Dakhla, which is in the Western Sahara, through horizontal infrastructure building of railway and, of course, road infrastructure. And that, of course, can only work if Mauritania, if you look at the geography, if Mauritania will cooperate. But Mauritania is in an extremely tricky position because it needs to balance its relationships with both Algeria and Morocco, and I see it highly unlikely that this is happening. At the same time, of course, all of this enhances its negotiating power, and we've seen this with security and economic cooperations being enhanced with both partners. Algeria's reaction, half a second, has been to launch own initiatives, free trade zones with Niger and Mali. It has announced that, and with Mauritania. But overall, I don't see a large conceptual framework response. I mean, it has done quite a bit with NISR, defense cooperation, etc. So it's more bilateral and not this overall framework.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't want to be intimidating. You had another few seconds.
No, but I want to get to the geopolitical things, Russia, etc. So it's very egotistical.
But I believe it's important to interpret these dynamics also having regard to the fact that the Sahelian countries are currently facing challenges vis-à-vis their southern neighbors in the ECOWAS struggle ongoing.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Jalel, when it comes to Libya, we deal with two rival authorities that deploy both formal and informal means of governance. So in this context, what are the main drivers of connectivity tying the two Libyan authorities to their neighbors to the south?
Yeah, I would like to begin by just toning down this idea of rivalry between the Tripoli government and the Benghazi government. For example, there was a moment in Tripoli in February of this year where General Burhan had a meeting with the Prime Minister in Tripoli, and one of the off-the-record requests was permission to use his Iranian-propped ability to conduct airstrikes potentially in southeastern Libya to defend himself from this corridor of military assistance from Haftar-held Tripoli to Darfur in support of General Hamati, and the response from the Prime Minister was no. So this idea of a stark rivalry between the two should be always diluted and minimized. And also, the other thing also is that we're talking about really southern Libya, and I would say that the Tripoli government is weaker and weaker there, has more issues to deal with at home, and the ability to, sometimes you see envoys and emissaries going in the Sahel, but right now what matters is really what the Haftar coalition does, if you wish to understand the southern part of Libya. And in terms of connectivity, what's interesting is that when you look at the territorial control aspect of things, you don't have continuity between the Fezzan and Niger and Chad, and you don't have continuity between southeastern Libya, the Kufra area, and Darfur. So the territorial control is very sparse. And media coverage has also been very sparse. So we really have to look at things locally. So here I'm referring to the Sudan conflict that Miret brought up. You've had continuously, since April 2023, a flow of aid. Of course, it has varied in volume between the Haftar coalition in southern eastern Libya into the hands of the rapid support forces in Darfur. This has never stopped. But the coverage existed at the beginning of the conflict. The media lost interest. Now a lot of people think that the aid in question existed only for a couple of months. In reality, it has never stopped. It varies. So we're talking about military equipment, ammunition, food, water, and fuel. And all of those are very strategic. So here what matters is the fact that the UAE is, of course, the common sponsor between the two actors, Hamati in Darfur and Haftar in Libya, and the UAE is not giving up on the RSF. So all of this keeps changing. So if you look at the military bases being used, and it just keeps dynamically evolving. So here the connectivity should be looked at in a very careful local way. If you don't look at it locally, you can't. Broad strokes won't cut it. The last thing that I would like to mention is that diplomatically, you have a more assertive Haftar coalition. That is, now we saw the visit from Saddam Haftar. Saddam Haftar is the most active, ambitious son of the field marshal, visit Burkina Faso, visit Niamey. And so you could imagine how things could change if there's more logistical facilities to just beef up this territorial continuity that is so missing. So the connectivity exists. Now we might see the manifestation from a territorial perspective.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Moving eastward, Miret, connectivity between the Horn of Africa and the MENA region seems to be heavily impacted by dynamics of cooperation and competition for access to natural resources in the context of climate change. So what are the main cooperation opportunities and challenges that you see in this region?
So there are multiple opportunities for cooperation, whether they're on trade or actually on technology, or on labor forces, but because I have 3.5 minutes, I'm just going to stick to one of the biggest draws of the region to other countries, and that's arable land. Specifically, since we're talking about MENA, we'll take a quick look about the Gulf and Africa and arable land. So the Gulf doesn't have very much water. It's got very little water, and the water supplies that it has are dwindling. The UAE, for example, imports more than 90% of its food. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia imports 80 to 90% of its food. So they need other sources of food. And over the last 15 years or so, they have been making a concerted effort around the world to try and source arable land and arable products. I think as of about 4 years ago, the UAE had bought up about 4.25 million fadens of arable land throughout the globe, Saudi Arabia a little less. Now, Africa is a huge draw for this. Africa has about 60% of the world's arable land. 60%, all right? I think about last year, Africa's agricultural exports totaled about 230 billion, but they could hit $1 trillion in 2030 with the right investments. They are hampered by a few things. They are hampered by low agricultural productivity. The methods are often old. It's old methods of agriculture. It's still drip. It's still, flood irrigation in most places. Harvesting is difficult. They're hampered by bad infrastructure. Good agriculture requires quite complicated methods of harvesting and delivery and totaling and all the rest of it. They are badly hampered by climate change, because we didn't mention this, but the MENA and Africa region are the two regions that will be hit worst, that are being hit worst by climate change. And actually, of the 20 countries most affected by climate change, 17 are in Africa. So you can imagine how this cuts through. And of course, there's political instability. Now, you take all those into account, and you realize why the countries of the Gulf start worrying about their investment, because they've sunk over $2.5 billion into African farms. I mean, there's between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they've sunk more than 400 million into Sudan alone. So it's a big investment, and it's a source of livelihood. So the stakes are extremely high, and they have been fairly stringent about not letting go of that arable land, and that stringency has perhaps exacted more of a price on Africa than anyone had thought. And I'm out of time.
Thank you very much. And perhaps last round of question, it's important to stress that connectivity is also about the connectivity of different conflict systems at different scales. So in that regard, Isabella, I would like to ask you, what are the repercussions of the growing geopolitical rivalries in the Maghreb? How does Russia's increasing foothold in the Sahel or Morocco's partaking into the Abraham Accord affect the dynamics of polarization or integration in the region?
Thank you very much. Let me just begin with China, which you haven't mentioned, which is not that important with regard to the Sahel, but I think it is important in shifting power balances within the Maghreb, especially on the economic level. I mean, Algeria used to be China's main partner, and what has been happening now is that Morocco and Moroccan-Chinese relations, especially manufacturing, EV batteries, etc., are just exploding. So and interestingly, with Algeria, it was always about infrastructure. With Morocco, it is very much about manufacturing. Morocco, by producing in China, by producing in Morocco, has the opportunity of getting into the free trade agreement with the US, as well as trade agreements with Europe. And it catapults or helps Morocco get into global value chains. So this, just for that, but Russia, of course, is the one that really linked to the Sahel is a huge issue, and it's a huge issue for Algeria. I mean, we have seen, we have pro-Russian military juntas, and the paradox that these juntas have at different times shown Algeria the cold shoulder. I mean, when, for instance, Algeria wanted to mediate between Niger and ECOWAS, Niger rejected that. Mali has, as we all know, backed away from the Algiers negotiated peace treaty with the Azad, with the Tuareg in the north. And so all of this is quite unsettling for the Algerians, but most unsettling is, clashes, regular clashes directly on its border between, on the one hand, Tuareg rebels and militant Islamist groups, and on the other hand, the Malian army backed or cooperating with Wagner/Africa Corps. So that has been a huge issue. Algeria has refrained from openly naming it, but it has made it clear in the UN that it doesn't want anyone at its borders. And I just came back from Algiers last week. It's very interesting, the discussions on Russia. I was told everything has been settled, everything is fine. And a very nice quote, the Russians have understood what the French have never understood. We don't want anyone on our borders. So this is, let's see whether the Russians have really understood. Now, the other thing, the Abrams Accords, of course, that has fueled the hostilities because Algerian anxieties are enormous. They're real. They're also used to domestically rally the population, but they're really real about the security cooperation between Israel and Morocco. Since Gaza, the discourses have shifted a little bit because Algeria has been able to be quite triumphant about the fact, or Algerian media talk about the mistake Morocco made with normalization, and they point to the huge anti-Israeli rallies in Morocco, while Moroccans have tried to say, yeah, but you're not allowing any demonstrations at all, etc. Morocco has also brought up the Iranian role in the region. Morocco has no diplomatic relations with Iran, but very interesting, Iran has recently, for the second time within a year, tried to make overtures toward Morocco. I don't think this is, or I don't know if this is going anywhere, but the way Moroccans interpret it is very interesting. You could read in the newspapers, this is because of the important and growing regional role of Morocco and importance also in sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Jalel, we noticed that foreign actors intervening in Libya, Russia, Turkey, Egypt, UAE, possibly others, are also increasingly active south of Libya, be it in Niger, Chad, Sudan, and beyond. How are these conflict systems influencing one another? And what is Libya doing to address the challenges to its stability emanating from the south, as well as challenges to its neighbors' stabilities emanating from Libya?
Yeah, I think I've spoken enough about the UAE, so I'm going to stay away from the UAE to answer your question. Just a quick remark about Russia and the connection between the various theaters. Sometimes when, let's say, you look at the incident in northern Mali that saw dozens of Russians getting killed in late July of this year, you have headlines saying, Russia is in trouble in Africa. Mm-hmm. Africa is not a country. So when you want to analyze how well or not well Russia is doing in a particular theater, just analyze each country separately. Absolutely. So it's really doing poorly in Mali, it's not doing great at all in Niger, as I said a few minutes ago, but it's doing fantastic in Libya. Libya is really Disneyland. It's a fairy tale host. It's beautiful, it pays you, it gives you free fuel. It's just absolutely heaven. So when you see conversations about, let's say, there were some rumors about potential conversation between the junta in Niamey and the Haftar coalition about reviving the Madama base that was evacuated by the French a few months ago. And it's basically a base that is located in the northern part of Niger. If you look at the satellite imagery, nothing has changed, nothing is happening based on what you could tell, based on OSINT. But it's mentally, if you start seeing this kind of facility emerge, you would see all of a sudden more of a logistical corridor between Haftar-held Libya and Niamey. And if that happens, it would be a big win for Russia. So that's what I wanted to say. Now, going back to another player that just was mentioned a few seconds ago, China. Here, as a game, I wanted to just use publicly available information. No research, no speculation, no hypothesis. If you look at the incident that unfolded in two steps this year, April and late June. In April, there was a scandal in Canada where one Libyan national was arrested in Montreal because he was accused by the federal police there of having participated in a conspiracy where some oil was sold, according to the authorities, sold by the Libyan National Oil Corporation at a voluntarily below market price in terms of where the crude oil was priced. So basically there was sales going from the Libyan National Oil Corporation off market. In other words, there was a gift attached to that transaction to China. And then once the oil arrived in China, basically you had most probably a transfer of payment or transfer of wealth from the oil company that bought the oil and a drone manufacturer. And then in June, those drones disguised as turbines sold to the NOC were discovered by the Italian authorities. So all of this is public. So here what's interesting is, first of all, the aggressiveness of China in terms of pleasing this oil producer called Libya, and how willingly it is violating international law. So the aggressiveness on the part of China with regard to Libya is something novel, and it should be noted. And also you could ask yourself how stupid it is to send drones via a free trade zone in Italy. Knowing that you have those growing connections to the south, there's no UN arms embargo on a country like Niger. So you could very well imagine, first of all, we should not imagine China giving up on this program of selling combat drones to Haftar. You'll see other attempts. But I would say that given the reality in the Sahel, why not send the drones in Niger? Because now you have growing territorial continuity between those players. So this is just food for thought. I think it's worth watching next year.
Thank you. Thank you, Jalil. Miret, Egypt is facing challenging developments in the Horn, with war raging in Sudan, tensions brewing with Ethiopia, and endemic insecurity in Somalia. So in that context, what are Cairo's foreign policy priorities in the Horn of Africa, and how does it fit in the complex diplomacy of the broader MENA region? And I know that the time is very intimidating, but we started a couple of minutes late, so I'm sure that our audience will indulge in a couple of minutes of patience to give you the time to properly answer this very complex question.
Okay. Egypt's foreign policy priorities in 2 minutes. Over the past couple of years, over the past year and a bit, Egypt has been hit with several geopolitical shocks that have shaken it up a bit. One is the war in Gaza on its borders. Then, of course, there's the Houthi aggressions in the Red Sea, which, as you heard on the first day, are costing Egypt more than $600 million a month, money that Egypt doesn't have. There's Ethiopia's quest with a seaport, which we referred to earlier. There's a lot going on. Now, I think most people who work on Egypt will tell you that they think that Egypt for a very long time had neglected Africa. It's funny because Egyptians are Africans, but I think they just hadn't paid enough attention. I don't think that's actually quite true, but what is definitely true is that the last decade or so has seen a massive acceleration in outreach to Africa. And over the past year or so, it's specifically been the Horn for both military and economic reasons. Now, again, we mentioned the issue with Somalia earlier, but Egypt has also reached out to Djibouti and Eritrea. Now, it's wanted a military base in Djibouti for a long time. And I think 2 years ago, President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi became the first Egyptian president to visit Eritrea since its independence in 1977. And that access with Somalia, Eritrea, and Djibouti insulates Egypt a lot from what may be happening with Ethiopia on the border. And again, not to mention the UAE again, but there has been a feeling that UAE has sort of gently nudged Ethiopia into the Somaliland deal, which may not be great for the overall peace of mind in the region. All right, so there is that. But It has brought along a few other changes as well. Oddly enough, all of these changes, they've brought Egypt closer to Turkey, something that really no one had foreseen a few years ago. But also there are rumors, there is reason to believe that Egypt is working with Saudi Arabia on reaching out to the Houthis. And if that is the case, that has a direct effect on Saudi Arabia's and Egypt's relations with Iran, which could change the makeup of the area quite a bit. So, yeah, just to wrap up super quickly, I think Egypt is paying a great deal of attention to the Horn, not just for the economics, which is important to it, because it's also interested in arable land, it's also interested in trade, but also for security and port reasons, particularly because it's concerned about the security of the Red Sea and the shipping.
Thank you.
Luca.
Thank you, Miret. I know you wanted to add a very quick remark, 30 seconds.
Yeah, 20 seconds to China. I think some of you may have noticed this. I think it's highly significant. When Xi, the Chinese president, traveled back from the G20, he made a stopover in Morocco, which is very significant. And at the same time, very significant, he was received by the Crown Prince and not the King himself. So I think these are two signals to look out for.
Very productive discussion, and thank you very much to ISPI for organizing this great panel. Thank you.